February is African American History Month, for those of you who don't know. And in this month, we celebrate the unique cultural contributions of the African American community to this very diverse and very proud nation. It hits a little closer to home, I think, here in Detroit, because we have so much of that culture ingrained into our subconscious, into what makes Detroit Detroit, whether that be Motown, or whether that be Joe Louis, or whether that be Willie Horton. All of this contributes to our understanding of Detroit's cultural fabric as inherently diverse, as inherently something to cherish. And yet, it causes tension. We have to understand that throughout Detroit's history, we've had struggle, we've had riot, we've had pain, we've had confusion, and this diversity, which adds so much to what we understand is inherent in Detroit, has also caused great suffering and great pain. Tonight, we're going to look at the demographic changes of Detroit. We're going to look at the civil rights movement and how it impacts our own backyard. And with us this evening is a distinguished professor of history from the Oakland University History Department, DeWitt Dykes. I'm very pleased to say that I've known Professor Dykes for a very long time, and I'm very, very happy to bring him in to share some of this history with us. So without further ado, Professor DeWitt Dykes. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming out on a fairly cold evening to hear a talk. And thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. And the more you talked about the things that you knew, I was beginning to think maybe you should give the talk instead of have me get up here. But it is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. And I have several things I want to try to talk about today. One of those is the political, economic, and social status of African Americans in the state of Michigan and how that has changed from the 1800s down to the present, what factors seem to have played a role in that change and some of the details of that. I also want to bring to your attention some statistics about population in Detroit and how when the loss of population began and how that has affected the economic and social fabric of the city and why, to some degree, the city is having problems now. A third factor is whether or not the 1967 civil disturbance, often referred to as the Detroit riot, what role it may or may not have played in the loss of population. And at some point, I want to bring up the whole question of the use of the term post-racial, and I think that you'll find my remarks interesting on that, etc. Now, Michigan has had a distinguished role in welcoming African Americans when many other areas have not. African Americans began to settle here before the Civil War. Some of them were free individuals with papers to prove it, so to speak. Others were fugitives from slavery who sought to find a place where they could be free and not found. In 1831, whites organized a Michigan Abolition Society, and they were very active in trying to oppose the institution of slavery and to try to bring it to the attention of others. In 1850, the United States Congress passed a law called the Compromise of 1850, but part of that was a very strong fugitive slave law designed to make it easy for persons who said their slaves had run away to find them and claim them, and gave no rights to the alleged or accused fugitive to offer any information in his or her defense. In response to that, the state of Michigan passed a series of laws in the 1850s called the Personal Liberty Laws, which tried to restore to any accused person, a person accused of being a slave, tried to restore to them the right to give testimony and to be represented, and required that district attorneys or state's attorneys in the state of Michigan represent those so accused to make sure that they received a reasonably equal treatment in Michigan courts. And in addition to that, as you probably all have heard many, many times, the Republican Party started in 1854 in Jackson, Michigan, and it was that party that said no more extension of slavery to new areas, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, which A, set off the Civil War, B, led to the Emancipation Proclamation, and C, of course, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which means that slavery was legally outlawed and prohibited in the future. And Michigan played some role in a number of these areas, and so we want to start with that. In addition, I would like to point out that the federal government, Congress, attempted to establish basic legal principles and laws that would give the former slaves reasonably equal opportunity to become self-sufficient and independent. First of all, the 14th Amendment, 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, defines citizenship so as to include all persons born or naturalized in the United States, so that it defines citizenship in such a way that the former slaves, as well as those who had been free before, should be considered citizens. It defined equal protection of the laws and equal rights for all citizens, but also equal protection of the law for all persons. But a number of things were attempted by the federal government to try to bring equality to the former slaves and to African Americans in general. There's a lot to be said, but I want to move on. One of the handouts that I've provided for you is called Civil Rights Issues in Michigan. And if you have that handy, I can refer to some things and not have to you won't have to rely solely on your memory. But what are listed here are several laws passed by the state legislature to bring some degree of equality to African Americans. 2 laws designed to prohibit segregation and racial discrimination in public education, 1867, and then again a court decision in 1869. Even in 1869, a law dealing with life insurance companies, prohibiting them from being discriminatory. What is not on this list is that one of the last acts of the U.S. Congress, before the end of Reconstruction, in 1875, Congress passed a law known as the Civil Rights Act, and the idea was that private companies and individuals would be prohibited from discriminating against blacks in transportation, restaurants, hotels, and other places serving the public. And had that law stood and been enforced, then probably much of what we know as the civil rights movement of the 20th century would not have been necessary. However, even though Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, in 1883, the United States Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, and they gave us a reason that it was based on the 14th Amendment, and they found a so-called legal way to say that the 14th Amendment didn't give Congress that power. Now, the reason I'm mentioning the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was overturned in 1883, Michigan's response was 2 years later, in 1885, to pass its own Civil Rights Act. And you can read what it says. It attempted to do some of the things, if probably not all the things, but most all of the things which the national law was designed to do. And it remained into the 20th century the basic law in which African Americans could sue businesses or or individuals who violated this principle. The last line of that particular section, that this law eliminated discrimination in opera houses and theaters in Detroit, after I discovered that I consulted the wrong book. An older book says it eliminated them. Another book says, well, some places stopped discriminating, but in the 1910s and 20s, in the 1910s and 20s, the NAACP had 11 lawsuits against theaters in Detroit. So obviously it didn't completely eliminate it, or either the time period, either after a while some of these companies started discriminating again, or maybe new companies. So that it eliminated it is a little overdone in terms of long term. One of the issues that was always a concern in Michigan and throughout the country was African Americans being served in restaurants. And often restaurant owners discouraged or didn't want blacks to be served in their restaurants. They often said that their white customers wouldn't like it, or some other reason. And in 1890, there was a Michigan Supreme Court case which used the 1885 law to say that it was unconstitutional, or illegal rather, to refuse service to blacks. So this particular case set an example, but in spite of that, many restaurants throughout the state continued to refuse to serve African Americans as late as the 1950s. I attended a conference where several individuals indicated that this particular provision, the Ferguson versus Gee's case was reinforced in later years by additional legislation, and that they went from one restaurant to another in Detroit looking for the opportunity to actually have a meal, and instead of being able to have a meal, they found it difficult that a white-owned restaurant would serve African Americans. This was especially a problem when the United Automobile Workers was trying to organize in the 30s and 40s, and they had both African Americans as well as white organizers, and they needed some place to eat lunch. And many of the restaurants would not serve both of them, and they often had to go to restaurants in the African American community which would serve whoever was available or wanted to be served. One of the events that has received a considerable degree of attention in recent years is the trial of Dr. Ocean Sweet, who attempted to move into a white neighborhood. And the situation was that in 1925, he found a home in a neighborhood that was a desirable middle-class neighborhood. And when he was able to purchase the home, he, his family, and some friends started the process of moving in. But the word spread that a colored had bought a house, and people gathered. It is said that hundreds of people gathered. How many hundreds is hard to know for sure, but somewhere between 500 or more gathered around the house, made it hard to get in or out, that they became unruly, that at least one policeman was around and observed but made no effort to disperse the crowd. And at some point, people in the crowd threw rocks at the house and harassed anyone entering or leaving. And at some point, the people inside the house fired a few shots. Presumably, they wanted to scare people, but at least one of the shots killed one of the men outside, at which point the police decided it was time to go and arrest the people in the house. And so Dr. Sweet and his family were arrested, and eventually there were two trials. One trial, the first trial The first trial resulted in no verdict, and the second trial resulted in an acquittal. And the issue of civil rights is basically, did an African American have an equal right to defend a home when they were being harassed by others for racial reasons or any other reason? And this trial indicated in this case that an African American could have the opportunity to, did have the right to defend their case at their home if they felt they were in danger. And as probably many of you know, this was a unique trial for many reasons, both in terms of the judge who presided over the trial, who later went on to be governor of Michigan and then on the U.S. Supreme Court, and the lawyer from Chicago, Clarence Darrow, who was hired to represent the Sweets and who was very, very good and somewhat flamboyant, but he was able to get them to, the jury to declare the Sweets not guilty. They tried one person and felt that if they couldn't get that person convicted, then the evidence against the others was weaker. In 1927, there was a case about theaters discriminating against blacks in Grand Rapids, and there are a couple of books out on the Grand Rapids, African Americans in Grand Rapids, and one of them covers this case. But in many situations, the African Americans had to take a company to court to try to get equal treatment. And something, of course, that many of you probably have heard, that in southern states, African Americans were supposed to sit either in a balcony in a theater, sometimes in the second balcony instead of the first. Well, in this case, the theater in Grand Rapids did the same thing. And on the one hand, the many whites in Michigan were not in favor of the worst kinds of discrimination that occurred in the South, but likewise they weren't ready for integration, so to speak. They weren't ready for integration of neighborhoods. They accepted a limited integration in public schools. They were not ready for upgrades of job opportunities for African Americans. And even though Henry Ford decided on his own to hire substantial numbers of African Americans, and though many of them were concentrated at the River Rouge plant, some of them were in higher positions than just entry positions at the Henry Ford. So that the efforts to fight against racial discrimination in theaters, restaurants, hotels continued until the 1950s. The Federal Housing Administration, a federal agency which started in the 1930s, Federal Housing Administration employed a practice of redlining, as it was called. Redlining involved taking a map, assessing, having people go out and look at the homes on various blocks, determine what the physical condition and quality of the homes was, but also to determine the social issue of who lived there. Were they white Anglo-Saxons, or were they whites with mixtures of either immigrants and or Jewish people, for example? And if what was the quality of the housing in terms of also who lived there? They drew up 4 different categories, A, B, C, and D. But in drawing up the 4 categories, the A category, as you might imagine, would be the top category, mainly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, for example, that neighborhoods that had persons who were, say, either Jewish or immigrants, for example, would be in the B category. Neighborhoods that had other mixtures or additional mixtures or large numbers of persons who weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant would be in C category, and C and D categories would be older homes and homes that were declining, and of course the presence of one or more known African Americans would put the housing and the neighborhood in the lower ranks C and D. Now, there's some interesting things that can be said about how this all started, but the most important thing is that the Federal Housing Administration adopted this plan in the 1930s and continued it until the early 1950s. And they did so, and even after, if you skip over from 1930s down to 1948, in Sipes versus McGee was a Michigan case which involved neighborhood whites who wanted to use what we call restrictive covenants. The term restrictive covenants refers to a clause inserted into many of the property deeds when whites would buy a house. In many cases, a clause would be inserted that indicates that it would be illegal. This house cannot be sold or transferred to anyone except of the Caucasian race. And it was thought that by using this clause in a contract, that it would be illegal to break the contract by selling it to someone who was not Caucasian. Sometimes they added other details that only white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or something of that sort. And the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s and 40s encouraged white homeowners and whites who were buying homes to have a restrictive covenant. Their argument was they were trying to preserve the property values. They were trying to preserve the property values of these homes, and they believed or stated that when African Americans or Negroes moved in, that the property values would go down. And of course, it was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And what I mean by that is if one African American family moved into a neighborhood and the whites panicked and sold at cheap prices, then of course the prices would go down. But those who bought the houses at cheap prices, so to speak, or less than they were worth, would then turn around and increase the price greatly to try to sell it to African Americans who had limited choices. So redlining started out as a way of evaluating the quality of homes as well as who lived in the homes in certain neighborhoods. And the FHA had a policy of limiting which neighborhoods they would approve. They would approve for purchase by whites or others. They tended to favor whites buying into A and B categories, newer homes as much as possible, but homes in neighborhoods where only whites, white, preferably Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but definitely whites were living. And they encouraged whites to buy new homes in suburbs or on the outer edges of cities, as opposed to homes in the middle of a city or in the older neighborhoods, no matter how good the quality, no matter how good those qualities. So the Federal Housing Administration's redlining plan helped to make it difficult for anyone, regardless of race, to get a loan to improve the quality of their house or to make repairs. If they needed a loan to do that, they were not likely to get FHA approval for it, for example. But on the other hand, whites who wanted to buy newer homes, especially in the suburbs, and especially in the 1940s. This starts in the 1930s, but in the 1940s it becomes even more of a trend. And the FHA, in addition to their decisions about which homes in which neighborhoods they would fund, they also encouraged whites to put the restrictive covenants in their property deeds so as to further reinforce and keep the African Americans out. In 1948, the Shelley versus Kramer decision was given by the U.S. Supreme Court, and Shelley versus Kramer combined Spies versus McGee and I think one other case and was issued as a combined ruling. So the U.S. Supreme Court declares restrictive covenants unenforceable. It doesn't say that you can't make you can't do it, you can't make the agreement, but it says you can't enforce it in a court, which takes a great deal of the benefits from those who had hoped to use this to try to keep the various neighborhoods, primarily white neighborhoods. At the same time, the Federal Housing Administration did not immediately suggest that people stop using the restrictive covenants. They didn't suggest that they stop it immediately, but continued to say that they could use them into the early 1950s before they made a significant change. Now, one of the big problems with segregated housing is it made it harder. It made it harder for African Americans to get to know whites, and likewise it made it harder for whites to get to know African Americans, and especially to consider African Americans as persons that they could not only socialize with, at least at the neighborhood level, but also consider working with on an equal basis. And so that was a big problem. There's a book that I don't have on any of the materials that I've given you, a book that's called Origins of the Urban Crisis. Origins of the Urban Crisis. It's by a Detroit native, a man named Thomas Sugrue. Sugrue is S-U-G-R-U-E, Thomas Sugrue, S-U-G-R-U-E, Origins of the Urban Crisis. And I call your attention to his book for several reasons. One reason is that he has a reference that racism was for many whites a psychological wage, W-A-G-E, that racism was a psychological wage. And what he means by that is that many whites who were very concerned about keeping their neighborhoods white, many whites who were concerned with limiting any possible job opportunities for African Americans, and who might oppose any kind of promotion for African Americans, for example, that psychologically they were trying to assert their superiority, and even though it wasn't the same as money, it's not the same as money, it was something they expected to get from their jobs and from their social position. And Sugrue also says that segregated neighborhoods reinforced segregated job opportunities. That if whites and blacks didn't live in the same neighborhoods, then they couldn't get to know each other, and the whites who didn't want African Americans in equal roles on their jobs or equal opportunities for promotion at hiring and promotion, that they felt fully justified in these things because they didn't have any close acquaintance and association with African Americans. So he says a number of things like that. I'm going to come back to his book in a minute, and I'm sorry I didn't include something from that would give you the name of the book, Origins of the Urban Crisis, but it's an excellent book and has lots of valuable information. In the middle of the second page of the Civil Rights in Michigan, I'm skipped over something. Let's go back to the top. Employment opportunities increase as a result of. I'm sorry about that. African Americans in Michigan benefited from a number of things that some of which were not available, many of which were not available elsewhere, and some of which would only become available in the 1940s in this second item on the page 2. One of the most unique things for African Americans in Michigan was that Henry Ford decided in the 1910s to hire substantial numbers of African Americans. When the World War I was going on in Europe, it became difficult to have large numbers of immigrants continue to come to the United States. As many as 1 million or more immigrants were coming to the United States in the 1907, before and after. 1907 was the year in which the most came, over 1 million, I think 1,200,000 or so. And many immigrants would go into various cities around the country and take jobs in factories. And one of the problems was the work was hard, dirty, and dangerous. And some of them would last for many weeks or years. Others quit after a short period of time. Some got injured and could no longer continue. But factories in general depended greatly upon immigrants as new hires. And Henry Ford made several important changes. Everyone knows about his saying in 1914 that he was going to start paying $5 a day. And of course, thousands of people came to his factory in Highland Park, Michigan, looking for that $5 a day, but he didn't have large numbers of new jobs. But he had a reason. He had a reason for increasing the wage. Before he made this announcement, the average factory worker made about $2.30 a day, about $2.30. And his suggestion to increase it, double it to $5 was a very thoughtful decision on his part. What he had in mind is this, that if he paid workers more after they qualified, key thing is after they qualified, first of all, they had to work for 6 months. They needed to be a family man. They needed to have a savings account. They needed not to have bad habits like smoking, drinking alcohol, chasing women, and gambling. That's the short list. If there were any other negative qualities. And Henry Ford, on the one hand, was going to reward the best workers who were family men and would put the money in savings account instead of gambling, smoking, drinking it away, or giving it away to people who weren't their relatives, etc. But what he wanted to do was to build loyal, long-term workers. He wanted to build loyal, long-term workers who would be experienced, because having turnover meant inexperienced workers, less quality of work, for example, and a good deal of cost in just training new workers. So he's trying to build this long-term, loyal group of workers. That was his primary goal in offering $5 a day, and the average worker, no one could just go in off the street, so to speak, and start earning $5 a day. He had to be there 6 months minimum, and then to fit these other qualities. At some point during the late 1910s, Ford decided to start hiring African Americans in large numbers for some of the same jobs that the whites were working in. And he also made a decision to hire as many different white ethnic groups as possible. That is, to offer opportunities for immigrants and persons who had immigrant parents, to offer as many job opportunities for a wide diversity. Instead of one or two or a few, many. And whereas for those who were being hired, it looked like a humanitarian and wise policy, for Henry Ford, he thought this would A, make long-term loyal workers, and B, make it hard for unions to organize, because many of the white ethnic groups didn't like each other from what life was like back home in Europe. They were arguing and fighting each other back there, so they didn't particularly like each other here. So his feeling was they would make it hard for them to organize a union. So first of all, Ford began to hire a wide diversity of individuals. He required immigrants to learn English, go to school, become learn enough to become citizens, for example. He did a number of things to try to influence their lives, etc. But one of the most important things was that his commitment to hiring large numbers of immigrants and African Americans was a long-term commitment. And when in the 1940s, during World War II, I'm sort of skipping over, but let me come back to this and finish and then come back. Employment opportunities increased as a result of, one, industry-wide unionization in the 1930s and 40s. And the basic principle there was when the United Automobile Workers and also the other unions that were called CIO, for example, wanted to organize, their idea was all workers who worked for any one company they were organizing, all of those workers should belong to one union, that one union should represent them all. And what they had in mind was that they could do a better job of improving the pay and benefits for all of them instead of just the skilled workers. So they wanted to have what they called industry-wide organizing, and to include all black, white, immigrant, or whatever, for example, in one union. So that was their basic idea. And it helped increase the number of African Americans in the long run who worked in the auto industry as well as other industries. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph pressured Franklin D. Roosevelt to issue an order that all factories that had government contracts, and these government contracts were often called defense contracts, but all factories that had a federal government contract to produce items which they either sent to England or kept in the United States for their own use, that all of these be required to have no racial discrimination in hiring, promotion, or job training. And he issued Executive Order 8802 to prohibit racial discrimination in job training and hiring, for example, as well as promotions. And this increased the number of African Americans getting jobs in the 1940s, especially during World War II, by about 2 million. About 2 million additional African Americans got jobs that they may not have gotten through the operation of the Executive Order 8802. But World War II also meant that the whole society needed all people who could work to go to work and produce all sorts of products to help win World War II. So that also operated to get more people and more women involved in working. And the Executive Order 8802 established the FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Committee. This was a committee that had powers of persuasion. It did not have powers of making rulings that had to be followed, but it did have the power to shine a light on allegations that company X or Y or Z had discriminated on the basis of race in hiring, promotion, or job training. And they could publicize that they were investigating. They could ask the company to come to a hearing and to answer questions. And most companies would stop short of wanting to have a great deal of publicity, and if they had been accused of something, would consider making some changes so that it would be more satisfactory how they operated as based on this issue. Now, Michigan learned a great deal from Executive Order 8802, and what I mean by that is African Americans and liberal whites in Michigan felt that a similar kind of committee, Fair Employment Practices Committee, something of that sort ought to be working in Michigan. Something like that should be working in the state of Michigan. New York adopted a law like this based on the FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Committee, and Michigan eventually did pass a law, Act 251, establishing a Fair Employment Practices Commission to provide remedies for civil rights dealing with employment issues. And it was very needed because, as you can see in the first sentence under 1955, as late as 1951, the State Employment Agency, Employment Security Commission, was accepting job requests that specified white workers only. And other job requests might indicate certain nationalities shouldn't apply or whatever. But for those of us who are committed to equality, you might be surprised that as late as 1951, that an employer could not only register a request for workers with the state of Michigan, but specify that only whites or some other group, only whites were needed or be accepted or whatever. So the 1955 Fair Employment Practices Commission that Michigan started was supposed to try to remedy this problem. And in 1963, the new Michigan Constitution included a Civil Rights Commission. Since 1963, we have a Michigan Civil Rights Commission, which deals with the issues of fair employment practices, as well as other issues relating to age, gender, marital status, handicap, and other categories that I did not include. So Michigan is, in that sense, a standout. No other state has a commission like this that is in part of its state constitution. They may have laws and practices in trying to deal with these issues, but none other has something quite so similar. Now, many of you probably are aware of the public school situation in the state of Michigan. Several school districts, Pontiac and Detroit, best known, were ordered by courts to desegregate, and that has not turned. It initially started out reasonably well. Except that when it was time for the Pontiac School District to start, it is believed that the Ku Klux Klan bombed some buses. Somebody bombed some buses. They charged the Ku Klux Klan, and some of them went to jail, but they bombed some buses to prevent it from happening. Since then, of course, migration of whites away from Detroit and Pontiac has done away with the possibilities of having some sort of, quote, racial balance. Both of those school districts are essentially overwhelmingly and predominantly African American. And in addition to that, we have the situation where in Pontiac, they've closed one of their high schools because they didn't have enough students. And Detroit has a number of school buildings up for sale, etc. So let me make one or two quick comments, and then we will have questions and answers. I provided you with a demographic history of Detroit. It has statistics, and if you'll take a quick look at that, if you'll notice that in 1950, the total population of Detroit was 1,849,568, and it dropped a substantial amount, a couple of hundred thousand, almost a couple of hundred thousand in 10 years, and yet more in et cetera. So I wanted to point that out. Thomas Agrew's book, Origins of the Urban Crisis. Thomas Agrew's book, Origins of the Urban Crisis, points out that in the 1950s, about 50,000 jobs were eliminated at the River Rouge plant. And even though River Rouge is not in Detroit, many, if not most of its workers came from the Detroit area. He also says that thousands of jobs were eliminated at Chrysler, which was on the east side of Detroit, still is, and a number of companies that were suppliers to automobile industries also laid off thousands, large numbers of persons that would amount to thousands. And so population loss in the 1950s began substantially, and loss of jobs in the 1950s was another thing, and of course the loss of jobs has continued from the 1950s down to recently, and all of this is part of the reason that Detroit has a substantial decline of population, of tax base. Companies have moved out. Both manufacturing companies have moved out of Detroit, many of them have, and retail stores have moved out, and others, etc. Now, I wanted to point out then that Thomas Agru and others say that the big decline in population in Detroit begins in the 1950s with the elimination of some of these jobs, moving the jobs elsewhere, etc. So that's one point. And 1967 perhaps added to it, but didn't start it, and is not the sole responsibility. In the years that President Obama has been in office, his election and even re-election has often made some people use the phrase post-racial, as if now that big hurdle is over, that it is possible that an African American can be elected to the top office, that perhaps race is no longer significant or important. Well, that needs to be reevaluated in many different ways. First of all, there are people who intensely dislike the fact that he's in office based, if nothing else, on race. And there are examples of that. I'm not saying that all the opposition or most of it. A lot of the opposition is that those who don't like his party or his policies are against those, and so there would be much opposition just on that basis regardless. But there's the considerable evidence that people who are so concerned about whether he was born in Hawaii or not, that they're concerned, they're looking for some way to try to disqualify him even now. But the other thing is, I made a handout of 2010 article from the Detroit Free Press, 2 men off to jail and 05 cross burning. 2 men off to jail and 05 cross burning. This was not in Alabama, Georgia, or Mississippi. This is not too far from where we are now. For some reason, 2 men decided that a new African American neighbor was someone they didn't want in their neighborhood. And they didn't know how to express it other than using a cross burning. It is quite likely they don't know what they're doing, that they're probably not part of an organized group. But the insensitivity, if not some other qualities we could call it, the great human insensitivity is there. And William Faulkner, the novelist, made some very important comments about the past. One of the things he said is, the past is not over, it's still with us. And unfortunately, I would suggest that just as there are many persons open-minded enough to consider African Americans for any particular position for which it appears they're qualified, then we still have people who are willing to burn crosses, who might do other things, but even if they don't do something physical, who oppose African Americans, Asians, and others. I don't know if you remember a man named Vincent Chin was killed because he was an Asian American, and 2 auto workers, or at least one of them was an auto worker, were concerned about the Japanese selling so many cars in the United States and decreasing the number of jobs for American automobiles. But Mr. Chin wasn't even Japanese. Not that that would have made it any better. Killing anybody in an argument about something is not good, no matter what the argument is, etc. But had he not been Asian, they probably would not have attacked him. So there's a lot of negative things about a number of ethnic minorities, African Americans, Asians, Muslim Americans, for example, Arabs in general, etc. So a number of others we could list. So I've concluded with most of my comments. Like anyone who prepares to speak, we could talk longer, but I've been told that it's time to take questions and try to provide answers for whatever you have in mind. So thank you for your attention, and if you will raise your hand, we'll try to respond to your questions. Yes?
Did Henry Ford have a means of enforcing those other policies that dealt with the home life of his workers?
Henry Ford had what was called the sociology department, and he hired men to get to know the various workers. The sociology department could and often did go out to investigate home life. This guy says he's married, make sure he's got a wife. This guy says he has a savings account, check with the bank. This guy says he doesn't do things like gamble, smoke, drink, etc. Well, follow him around and see what happens. And not only did they have the sociology department from the 1910s at least into the 30s, the sociology department tried to enforce a variety of concerns. One of the things, Henry Ford believed in voting for conservatives in office. And the sociology department had both white and African American or Negro employees. And I know that the Negro employees would go and inform Negro churchmen as well as employers that if the vote for a certain candidate wasn't sufficient to get him elected, then some of them would lose their jobs. Some of them would lose their jobs, and if that candidate didn't win, they followed through by firing some of the people from that district. And so that's one of the things I meant when I said that whatever Henry Ford's preferences were, they tried to see that the workers followed them. But there's some evidence that workers and churchmen, because what Ford did with the Negroes, African Americans, was he and the sociology department had a couple of ministers that they used to recruit workers, that members of their churches could be referred to Ford, and if the pastor referred them, they would be hired. But it was a thought that on the one hand, these would be good, loyal, hardworking people. And of course, it became known in the African American community that it was good to belong to Second Baptist Church or to the Episcopal Church, the African American Episcopal Church, for example, and to get to know the minister and to qualify for one of these jobs. If you couldn't get it at the plant gate, then talk to this minister. And the ministers began to do this thinking that they were trying to make sure they had high quality employees going. This is what Mr. Ford's sociology people wanted, high quality employees for the jobs, but it also meant a certain loyalty to Ford and also a regular income to these persons who presumably would be grateful enough to give large donations to the church. But Ford himself would occasionally visit black churches, I don't know how many, but some of them once or twice a year and donate money directly. So does that answer your question? It wasn't an idle thing. It was not, we hope you do this. They did have a method of following up and investigating and et cetera. Yes. Yes, I think you're next. And
PBS last year in 2013 had a DVD about Henry Ford, and it was very informative. It was on one of the PBS stations for an hour and a half, and it showed how he had dancing classes for the girls that were young under a certain age. He made the mothers make them go because he provided the place for it. So he was very structured, as you're saying, as a certain they weren't coincidences. He had a guideline of what he wanted his employees to be.
You're quite right. I remember seeing that. I'd forgotten about the dance class, but I focused on other parts of it. But you're quite right. And PBS often has outstanding programs. They had one Monday night called Spies of Mississippi, which is not directly related to today's talk, which will be repeated on this Sunday at 12 midnight. So you can always, record it and then watch it later. But it was how in Mississippi the state government started what they called a sovereignty commission. But what they did was to spy on the civil rights movement and learn a great deal of information about them. And I just talked to a guy who is this afternoon, who's going to speak tomorrow. Charles Cobb is going to speak tomorrow at 12 noon in the Oakland Center on seeking civil rights and freedom in 1960s Mississippi. And he said that the head of the state police stopped him once, knew who he was, called him by name, and suggested he go back to the college he used to attend before he came down there in Mississippi, that he needed to finish his education. And it's because they had investigated all the civil rights workers, white, black, etc. So yes. Yes, Brian?
When I was in college, there were two young men in one of my communications courses who talked about being college-educated African Americans and being ostracized in the ghetto culture that they've been raised in the heart of Detroit. With the emergence of, I guess you could call them prominent African Americans, like Barack Obama, Dr. Benjamin Carson, Herman Cain to some extent. Do you see, as an African American scholar yourself, that this ghetto culture is being effectively combated by the African American community itself, or will it take more efforts on behalf of academia and also socioeconomic change to make this ghetto culture evolve?
That's a fascinating question. I think it's going to take the whole society to change the so-called ghetto culture, because unfortunately the young men who like to wear their pants falling down on their behinds, and if I see one in my class, I tell them to pull them up. Well, I occasionally do, and occasionally even a white guy thinks he's going to imitate them. Which I don't fully understand. I understand they're appreciating the music and so many other good things, but why accept that? Unfortunately, in the public schools where there are large numbers, overwhelming number of African Americans, some of the African Americans, especially those who are relatively poor economically, and who don't have the right a certain parental support, they have publicized this notion that trying to learn is being white. And if they want to be black culturally, they're not supposed to try to learn. And having a C average is sufficient is unfortunately their idea. And at the same time that they think that having a C average is sufficient, and some of them don't learn much that this isn't going to work until they're ready to graduate, and others don't care. Most of them eventually wake up and realize they've got to try harder and learn more. But at the same time, some of these people who accept this notion that they shouldn't work hard in school, they shouldn't try too hard to do these various things, they should just exist, as far as I can tell, is what they believe. At the same time, when it's time to vote for someone to be mayor of Detroit, they want some smart black guy. And I lived in Detroit a long time. I've moved out recently, but if I was there, I would have voted for Duggan. I mean, I want the most competent person. And unfortunately, some of the I thought Dennis Archer was very good. I never voted for Kwame Kilpatrick, and I hold that up as a badge of honor. He never fooled me. I didn't know he was as bad as he turned out to be, but I thought he was too young. I thought he just wasn't, and after 4 years, I couldn't reward him. I didn't think he had done a good job compared to what there was. And now we discover that at some point, he and his administration made this to try to take care of the debt they anticipated coming up with the pension. They agreed to an unfavorable loan under conditions which may not even be legal. They're now challenging the legality of the loan. And I heard that that wasn't a good loan, but even if he never did anything that was illegal, his whole attitude toward governing was not trying to find the best long-term solution, but finding short-term solutions to take care of this, and hopefully other things would improve and we'll just go along our merry way. So no matter, even if he never did anything illegal, I don't think he would have been a good mayor, period. And I think Dave Bing was a wonderful man as a human being. He was a poor politician, and you've got to be a reasonably good politician in addition to having some good ideas or promoting some good ideas in terms of what's good for the community. And does anybody know what I mean by a poor politician? Yes. What do I mean?
He didn't know how to play the game.
Someone asked him a question, and instead of saying, we're considering that and we're going to work hard to achieve it, etc., he says, I need help. Well, everybody needs help, but you're not supposed to publicize it. You're supposed to say you've got some ideas under review and you're consulting with people, and there are some key strategic individuals that you've still got to talk to before you make some decisions. No matter, the wording is less important than act as if you've got some clear ideas and you're working to achieve them. It just takes time. And, I think he did the right thing by not trying to run again. And I think he got blindsided by some of the personnel problems that developed that he didn't anticipate. And I think, had he been mayor years ago, things may have gone more smoothly for him. Might have been a little easier, but I think, as far as I can tell, Dugan is the best choice. And unfortunately, there are people who are concerned about, is he black or white? It's totally unimportant. It's background, first in county government, and then with the Detroit Medical Center, and a number of things means he's the best choice at this time. And if things get to the point where he can do a good job, more than likely he will. So are there other questions? Yes.
How do you feel about the contributions or non-contributions of the Reverend Jackson and Sharpton?
Of who?
Reverends Jackson and Sharpton for the African-American community as a whole?
Well, I think Reverend Jesse Jackson made some important contributions during the Civil Rights Movement. I think that some of the things he's done have been helpful. I think when he ran for president, it helped to pave the way for others who would do better, including Barack Obama, for example. And now we owe one thing to Jesse Jackson that you may not realize. He's the one that said we'll stop calling ourselves black, we're going to be African American. In 1989, January 1989, he called this conference of his friends, and afterwards that's what they said, and all of us fell in line afterwards. There are people who feel that Jesse Jackson is out to benefit himself, and certainly he's done that in the process. And I think he's made a few mistakes. As far as I can tell, he's been largely well motivated. Many people are headline seekers, but I think for the most part he's done a good job. I think Reverend Sharpton is doing an excellent job on television. I see him occasionally, and I think he's done an excellent job on television. I was not a fan of his some of the things he did before he got on television. But as far as I can tell, he's doing a very good job on TV. So, other questions or comments? Yes.
You know, Brooks Patterson got himself in trouble recently with some comments made about Detroit.
Yes.
So some of the folks in Detroit said he had a lot of nerve because Oakland County was largely responsible for Detroit's problems. Could you tell me what they would be referring to?
I don't know if I can, to be honest. I would say that there's a general feeling that the suburbs have been instrumental in stalling or not allowing for plans to develop mass transit, especially a railroad, some sort of railroad system. And the efforts to get either a subway or a light rail system in Detroit go back to the 1970s. It actually goes back further than that. But in modern times, it goes back to the 1970s. When Coleman Young got into office, he wanted a subway line up Woodward and one up Gratiot. And there's considerable evidence that when Gerald Ford was president, he agreed to put up, his administration was going to put up hundreds of millions of dollars to help bring it into existence. And it is believed that lack of cooperation, if not vetoes by suburbs, is why it never happened. But if you can imagine, if you take a look at the demographic history of Detroit, that in 1970 there's 1,511,000, and still in 1980, 1,203,000. Most of those people would probably still be in Detroit if we had a light rail system that tied jobs in the suburbs with Detroit. Is a simple way of putting it. And once we get some sort of light rail system in Detroit, and people see the benefit of it, it's likely that it'll be extended in other directions. Ann Arbor would like to have a connection. Pontiac would like to have a connection. I suspect Macomb County would like to, but I don't know. And I am tremendously impressed that some well-to-do people put up $25 million of their own to try to bring the M1 system, as they call it, into existence. And one of these is Roger Penske, who has a truck leasing system, and obviously not everybody uses trucks. And he did have a car company, sold new cars and all that. So, in other words, there doesn't have to be a direct competition between selling cars and trucks and having a mass transit system. There are lots of people who don't drive, others who prefer not to drive all the time, and all the reports are that any community that builds one of these will find new development, economic development near it, and it will improve things. Houston has one that's only a few years old. I wrote it. It's in a great place, and it runs in an area similar to Woodward Avenue. There are museums, hospitals, universities, and other places like this near it. And the night I was there, I wrote it between 6 and 8 one night, and it was packed, just packed. Beautiful cars, packed. And places like in Texas and in Los Angeles and others are either building or expanding. And Los Angeles needs it even worse than we do, because of the congestion of the traffic, for example. And Chicago, I think, is a wonderful example of how you can have expressways, but also rail. And because Chicago did their rail system back in the 30s, if not sooner, it is sometimes easier to get from Chicago to one of the suburbs. It's easy to get from one suburb to another by rail than it is by car. I tried it one day. It took me forever to go east-west in one of the suburbs, but catching one of the rail systems and going there, the time that you build it means integration of transportation and housing. Transportation and housing are integrated along transportation routes. That's simple, and that's why Chicago has more population, has kept most of its population. till recently they had downtown department stores, plus what we have at Somerset is called Miracle Mile in Chicago, and it's downtown, you know, and whereas we may not have had a Miracle Mile or that particular, we would have had something more had certain things gone better. You have a hand up, sir? Yes.
I read recently that there are now more Detroit children enrolled in charter schools than in the Detroit public schools. I couldn't believe that. Are you aware of any studies that would indicate whether this is a good development or not? whether it would enhance academic achievement among Detroit children?
First of all, I'm not, you think you read that there are more in charter schools?
Correct.
Well, I don't know about that. It's not something I spend much time studying.
I can't cite you where I saw it. I think it was the Free Press, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think that maybe 25% of Detroit children are in charter schools. It seems to me that's a kind of figure that I remember hearing recently, 25%. Charter schools are not the answer to the problem. It works well for some children, but unless you're going to make the whole school system charter, which I don't think people are going to do, it leaves many people out. Charter schools are, under the best of circumstances, selective. So if you go into a particular public school and you select the students who scored the highest and who seem to have the most ability, pull them out and put them in a charter school, well, yes, they should do well. But every child that leaves the public school system to go to a charter school takes money away from the public school system and makes it harder to teach those who are left. And unfortunately, class sizes in most public schools around the country is too high. And especially, one of the things that Governor Snyder is talking about is all children need to go to preschool before they go to kindergarten. And lately, we've been talking about, they say they have waiting lists. They shouldn't have waiting lists. All children need to go to get that head start at the beginning as opposed to wait till they get to kindergarten. And there are programs such as Head Start and others that are available, but our citizens don't always want to put up the money to improve it, and then they complain, well, these people are dropouts and they robbed me. Well, put them in Head Start, teach them. Hopefully, if you indoctrinate them properly early enough, they won't fall for this stuff that learning and achieving is not right, you know, that this isn't black. And it's unfortunate, but Frederick Douglass and many others we could cite, the one thing they wanted was to be able to learn. It's one thing they wanted. And a lot of things that, you know, it's just tragic. It's just tragic that we don't have sufficient parents to insist that their children study and do well and excel and ignore all those people who are telling you wear your pants down and don't study, etc. It's a problem. It's a problem. And I'm not sure what the answer is to it, because you would think that with examples of African Americans, male, female, and others who've achieved, that those would be the models. But there are times when people don't seem to realize there's a relationship between hard work and studying in school and later achievement. One thing that I wish would be publicized more is that I've heard on the radio that the cost of going to college has gone up so much that it's thousands of dollars of debt that people come out with. And the only thing that is higher is the amount of money a person loses if they don't go to college. That the disparity in wage earnings is something like 63% between college graduates versus high school graduates. So it's increased substantially. And I think it's unfortunate that many of the high school students are more concerned about pleasing their friends or fitting in with their friends than trying to study and do well. And I think of a fellow who several years ago told me he wanted to be a judge when he grew up, but I couldn't get the man to write a term paper. Judges issue written decisions. He wouldn't write a term paper. I mean, he turned in something that I totally rejected and saying, "I'll give you one more chance." He never turned it in. And I don't know what you can do with those kind of people. You know, he never turned it in. Something that was acceptable. And I told him what was wrong with it and what he needed to do, and I could talk more, but that's, you know, there are individuals who get so set in doing what their friends do or whatever that they just can't turn around. And even though he wanted to be a judge, I don't think he understood. You know, I think he saw a judge on TV render some, not Judge Judy, but the others. I know you think of Judge Judy or the other judges, but I'm talking about the ones who issue 50 to 70-page opinions. You know, every time they say somebody issued that, I'm thinking, wow, you know, here I am writing a 10-page article or something to send in, and these people have, what, 40, 50, 60 pages? My gosh, I'm impressed. I wonder how long, and plus it only takes them a few weeks to do it. And I'm doing research and writing and months and years, and finally producing something that's much less than that. But, you know, it's hard to understand sometimes what some people are thinking. So are there other questions? Or I'm enjoying talking to you. You've got excellent questions, and I'll be happy to answer any more, or either now or informally later. So it looks as if you had enough for one night. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you again.